Everyone to our channel, the Kingdom Zoology. So I would be actually taking up the nervous system forward today, and just a recall what we have done in the nervous system till now. The lecture 1 of nervous system that you can actually watch on my channel. That was the introduction to the structures of neurons. And lecture 2 on the other hand was basically about the types of synapses, chemical and electrical synapses. So you can always have a look at these videos whenever you want to revise the structures of neurons as well as types of synapses. Now this is our lecture 3 of the nervous system, and our agenda today would be actually understanding various types of neurons. Types of neurons, in the sense there are various bases of classifying the neurons. Some of them actually will be structural basis, some will be functional basis. That means you can actually divide the neurons into different categories or different types on the basis of their structures as well as on the basis of their functions. Okay, as you might recall from our lecture on the structure of neuron, a neuron structure consists of a main cell body that is called cyton and some cell processes which are short, afferent or sensory in nature, that is dendrons, and a single long efferent or motor process that is called the axon. So now let's take up the different types of neurons, first on the basis of their structure only, because that structure which we discussed in the lecture number 1 was called a typical structure of a neuron in the body. But is it true that every neuron has exactly that kind of a structure? In reality, no. Okay, so types of neurons on the basis of their structure, because there will be a lot of variations. So let's divide the neurons on the basis of structure. Now on the basis of structure, the neurons can be called, number 1, unipolar neurons. Now if you know chemistry, polarity is basically what? Charge separation in chemistry. Okay, so in case of neurons, polarity, like in H2O in chemistry, H2O has got basically what? One oxygen and two hydrogens attached to it. Now there are positive charges on hydrogen and there's a negative charge on oxygen, so this is what? Polarity. Similarly, in case of neurons, the term polarity refers to basically what? Functional separation. Functional separation in the sense, what exactly are the dendrons supposed to do? They are afferent or sensory. That means what will the dendrons do? Collect the information. At the same time, the axon is what? Efferent, also called motor, which means what is the axon going to do? Take the transmission of the impulse forward. Dendrons collect, axon transmits. So that is what? Polarity, functional separation between the dendrons and the axons. So polarity in chemistry means charge separation. In biology or in case of neurons, polarity means functional separation. So when I'm talking about unipolar neurons, these are the neurons that actually contain a cell body, that is a cyton, and a single process. When you talk about the process, what exactly does that mean in case of a neuron? Projection. So let me draw the structure of a neuron which has got a cell body with a nucleus, that's a cyton, and a single process like this. That's a unipolar neuron. Here's the cell body, this one, and a single process, that is your this projection here. So what do you think this is going to act as? A dendron or an axon? The reality is none of them, because for a neuron to actually become functional, it must have at least one cell body, one process that can collect the information, and another process that can actually transmit the information forward. So minimum of 2 processes or projections will be required for a neuron to become functional. A neuron having a single process, this is not going to do anything, because in a single process you can't neither collect nor transmit. Okay, so unipolar neurons have got a cell body and a single process which can behave as, or which cannot behave as, dendron or axon. It's nothing basically. Where are these neurons found? These neurons are found in the human embryos. These are found in our embryonic stages. And these are obviously what? The non-functional developing neurons. In the embryonic stages, the first neurons that develop are unipolar neurons. They don't perform any function because they can't. They've got just a single process, and it's not that they will never perform any function. They are undergoing development. In future, they would basically become functional. Right now, however, they are unipolar and they are non-functional in the embryonic stages. So that's one type of neurons, unipolar. All right, the next type of neurons in the body which are possible are bipolar neurons. Now this is what I just showed you. Bipolar. How many processes? 2. So neurons having 2 processes are called bipolar neurons. Out of these processes, one is dendron and the other is going to be axon. So if you want to basically represent this neuron, it would be something like this. This process, these will be the dendrites, all of them. The dendrites will collect together to form a dendron, which would lead into a cell body or the cyton, and the cyton would basically continue forward to divide into what? Axon. So now if you look at this neuron here, there is a central cell body in it, this one, and 2 processes. One process, dendron, collecting the information, the other process, axon, transmitting the information. So this obviously is going to be what? Functional. Okay. So these are going to be functional neurons. And where do they exist in the human body? The bipolar neurons are found in retina of your eyes to help in vision. They are found in your internal ear to help in hearing, and they are also found in olfactory epithelium of your nose. That is the other term for the smell receptor surface of our nasal cavity. Which part of the nasal cavity? As you might recall from the respiratory system, all the olfactoreceptors, the smell receptor neurons, are present in the internal nasal cavity. So if you look carefully, your sense of vision, sense of hearing, and sense of smell, all of them are actually dependent on what type of neurons? Bipolar. So just a quick recall till now. Unipolar neurons with a single process cannot perform any function because one process can neither behave as a dendron nor as an axon. Bipolar, 2 processes, one dendron, one axon. So they are functional, found in the retina, ears, and olfactory epithelium. Well, next guys will be the most common type of neurons that we have in our body. The structure, lecture number 1 of a neuron that we discussed, with a single cell body and a lot of dendrons and a single axon. This typical structure where we had a lot of dendrons here, a single cell body and a single axon, this was a multipolar neuron. So here's your multipolar neuron. Now if you talk about multipolar neuron, as the name is suggesting, this will be having many dendrons and a single axon. But then the reality is that there are many processes, that is why what do we call it? Multipolar. But out of those many processes, who are actually Many in number, dendron, because axon is always single in all neurons. So if I draw the structure, that is what we had done earlier also. These are all the dendrites joining to form various dendrons like this. So all these structures are the dendrites, dendrons. To differentiate them, here are the dendrites and the dendrons. On the other hand, if you look at this structure, I have drawn a few dendrites here also, but all of them join to form a single dendron that is connected to the cell body. Here, this is the cell body in the center, but we can notice that there are many dendrons connecting to the cell body in the center, which is also called the cyton. And then there is a single axon arising from the cell body that would be actually finishing at the axon terminals. So when you look at this structure in this neuron, we can notice that there are many dendrons attached to the cell body and there's a single axon. That's the shape of a typical multipolar neuron, the one that we had discussed in detail. Where are these neurons found in the human body? In the brain. Every single neuron in your brain is multipolar in shape in adult stages. What are your neurons in the embryonic stages, in the brain, spinal cord? Everywhere, all of them are unipolar. But when you become adults, some of the neurons at these locations become bipolar, but some other neurons inside the brain become what? Multipolar. So all the neurons found in the brain of the adults. Why did I specifically mention of the adults over here? Because brain of an embryo will be having unipolar underdevelopment neurons. Yeah, so found in the brain of adults and also in the ventral roots of the spinal cord. Now this is an interesting word over here, ventral roots of the spinal cord. What does this exactly mean? Just to give you a brief idea, even though we will be discussing the brain and spinal cord in our further lectures, but this, let's say, is your spinal cord, which goes up to continue forward as the brain. These are the different portions of our brain, which we'll be mentioning later on as the medulla oblongata, pons viroli, midbrain, diencephalon, cerebrum, and cerebellum. And here is your spinal cord. Now if you talk about dorsal and ventral, here is the bone, another bone. These are the bones supporting your or providing skeleton to your brain. So what is all this? Cranium. Here's the nose of the person, here's the upper jaw, here's the lower jaw, and that is basically the body. So the spinal cord of course doesn't end over here. That is just a smaller view that I had drawn. If I take it further down, the spinal cord will continue to go down as well along the length of the entire body. So in this person, if we see in the human body, we can say what is the front side called? Ventral surface of the body. And what is the back side called? The dorsal surface of the body. So similar is about the spinal cord also. In the spinal cord, this side here, the back side is basically called what? Dorsal side, and the front side of the spinal cord, that is this one over here, is called the ventral side. So there are two different types of neurons on the two different sides of the spinal cord. All the neurons in your brain, what are they? Multipolar. But in the spinal cord, the neurons present on this side, the ventral surface of the neurons, the ventral surface of the spinal cord, all the neurons on this side are called ventral roots of the spinal cord. So all the ventral roots of the spinal cord, or all the neurons present on the ventral side of the spinal cord, what are they? Multipolar. What about this side? There's a dorsal side also of the spinal cord, that is this one. So here the neurons will be different type, the type number 4 that we will discuss in a while. So for now, multipolar neurons, all the neurons in your brain and all the neurons on the ventral surface of your spinal cord. So these neurons are also called the ventral, the roots of the spinal cord. Okay. So now going forward, the fourth and last type of neurons on the basis of structure after unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, the next will be pseudo-unipolar neurons. Now if we look at the term, what is the meaning of the word pseudo? I hope all of you remember it from the animal kingdom lectures where the word pseudo-coelom was used to indicate the false coelom of the animal. So the word pseudo basically means false. And what exactly is the name here also? Unipolar. So these neurons are also named as unipolar, but the reality is they are pseudo-unipolar, which means they would look like a unipolar neuron, but they are actually not unipolar. Let me tell you how. Let's say there is a neuron in the embryonic stages. What is it supposed to be? We've just mentioned above, unipolar. Unipolar neuron of the embryonic stages. It grows to become a bipolar neuron, but in that bipolar stage, both the processes, that is the dendron with the dendrites and the axon with the axon terminals at the end, they're very close to each other. But doesn't matter. As long as there are two processes, what should we call it? Bipolar. Here's the cell body. Here's your dendron. And here's your axon. So the unipolar neuron of the embryonic stages becomes bipolar. Bipolar with one dendron and one axon attached to the cell body. However, we can notice that the processes are very close to each other. So what happens in future to this neuron is these parts of both the processes. We can notice that both the processes are separate right now, but this part and this part of both the processes merges together because of their proximity, which means if we look at this neuron where both the processes have once again merged together, it may start looking like this. From the embryonic stages when it was unipolar, it already becomes what? Bipolar. But from the bipolar stage, again, because of fusion of this portion of the processes, it looks like that the neuron has got a dendron and an axon. Same dendron and axon which were there earlier. Here's the axon and here's your dendron and here's your cell body. But if you look closely, what does it look like? It looks like that there is a single process arising from the cell body. There is a single process arising from the cell body that is bifurcating into two. That is how it appears right now. But if we go a step back, we'll realize that this is not the truth. As of now in this picture, it is looking like what? A cell body giving rise to a single process, and that single process later bifurcates into two. But was this actually the case? No, because we know that originally how many processes had already developed on this neuron? Two. So from the unipolar neuron of embryonic stages, it had already become what? Bipolar. But now it has again started looking like a unipolar neuron with a single process arising from the cell body. And it appears that that single process later on divides into two parts, dendron and axon. While the reality is the two processes were already differentiated a step before. So let me write the description here. It was a unipolar neuron of the embryonic stages. What did it become? Bipolar. Later, the two processes which were already separate, which means it was a bipolar neuron. The two processes fuse at their end which is near the cell body or the cyton. The two processes fuse at their end or the terminal that is close to the cell body or the cyton. So it looks like that there is a single process arising from the cell body. That means appears falsely like a unipolar neuron again. This neuron appears falsely like a unipolar neuron again. And that single process which seems to be arising from the cell body appears to be dividing into two processes. So it looks like that there is a single process arising from the cell body that divides into two. But the reality is, if you go a step back, you would notice that it had already become bipolar. After becoming bipolar, it has again started looking like unipolar, which is why, since it is just looking like a unipolar neuron only, what is the name? Pseudo unipolar. A neuron that falsely looks like a unipolar neuron. A unipolar neuron of the embryonic stages had become bipolar, but once again started looking like a unipolar neuron. That's pseudo unipolar. And where are such neurons found in our body? Only at one place. What place? Here. What side of the spinal cord is this? Dorsal. Ventral we already have mentioned. What type of neurons are in the ventral side of the spinal cord? Here. Multipolar neurons. What about dorsal side? The dorsal side has got what? Pseudo unipolar neurons. And this is the only place in the body where pseudo unipolar neurons are found. Such neurons are present on dorsal surface of the spinal cord. And as I just told you, all the neurons on the ventral surface of the spinal cord are called ventral roots. Similarly, all the neurons found on the dorsal surface of the spinal cord are called dorsal roots. So I can write it down like this also, that the dorsal roots of the spinal cord are pseudo unipolar. So this, guys, was the end of neurons on the basis of their structures: unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, and pseudo unipolar. But then there is one more classification of neurons, not on the basis of their structure, but on the basis of their functions. The other classification of neurons is on the basis of their functions. And on this basis, the neurons can be divided into three types. The three types are sensory or afferent neurons, motor or efferent neurons, and the third one is interneurons. Interneurons are also called relay neurons, association neurons, other terms. Okay, so Let me first explain these to you in a diagrammatic form that would help you understand all the things, and then we can write down the definitions. Let's say this is my brain over here. As we were discussing, is the spinal cord which continues up as the brain. So here's my brain, which is of course located in my head. That's my spinal cord going down. Here's my upper jaw, lower jaw, so that's my face, let's say. And that's my neck, that's my rest of the body. And let's say from here is arising basically what my arm, that's my elbow joint here, this is my forearm, ending in the hand. That's the rest of the body. So if I touch an object here, let's say any maybe glass of water, that is filled with cold water, what do you think my brain is going to interpret this object's temperature as? Cold. Why is that so? Because look at this structure. There are certain neurons whose dendrons are on this side, and they are collecting the information about the cold temperature, and the axon is basically going along my arm. So can you notice that the axon is a very long process in this case, and finally relaying the information to my brain. So if you talk about an individual neuron, in a single individual neuron, which is this green neuron that I've drawn over here, which portions are sensory? Who is collecting the information? Dendron part. And who is transmitting the information to the brain? Axon part. Let me just basically adjust this picture a bit in our frame of view here. So in this picture now, as I was telling you, which portions of the neurons are collecting the information about the temperature? Dendron. And then who's transmitting the information to the brain? Axon. So in a single neuron, what is called a sensory process, the one that collects the information? Dendron. And what is called a motor process, the one that is taking the information to the target organ, that is the brain over here, that's the axon. But right now we are talking about what is this entire neuron doing. This entire neuron is telling your brain about the temperature of this object. So even though in this neuron, dendrons are sensory and axon is motor, but overall, what property is this neuron showing for your body? It is telling your brain about the temperature of a foreign object. So what type of neuron do you think is this? It's a sensory neuron. This type of neuron is a sensory neuron. So if I go to the definition here, sensory or afferent neurons, they are the ones that collect the external stimuli and transmit the information about these stimuli to the central nervous system, collecting the external stimuli and telling your brain about those external stimuli. These type of neurons are called sensory or afferent neurons. Then If let's say the temperature of the object is very hot and I accidentally touch it, what am I supposed to do? Either throw the object away or detach my fingers from it. I may let the glass fall, I may throw it away because otherwise it would have burnt my fingers. So what do you think is responsible for this? Let's see. There is another neuron here in the brain, but this time we can notice where exactly are the dendrons in the brain. And here is the axon, and we can notice that the axon is coming down into the muscles of your arm. Here is the striated muscle of your arm. Let's say I can actually bring it down over here. And what muscle do I have at this place? The neuron is going to basically end like this, releasing neurotransmitters on your striated muscles of the arm. So look at this neuron now, the pink one. What is it doing? It is transmitting the information from the central nervous system to a target organ. This type of neuron is called motor neuron. Once again, in this neuron also, who are sensory processes, dendrons, who is the motor process, axon. But what is the overall property of this neuron for your body? Transmitting the information from your central nervous system to target organ. So this is a sensory neuron and this one is a motor neuron. Okay, so here is your motor neuron. So if I define it over here, motor neuron, these are the ones that collect the stimuli from the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Collect the stimuli from the central nervous system and transmit them to the target organs. Who are the target organs mostly? The muscles. So neurons that begin from your brain and bring the information to your muscles, what type of neurons are those called? Motor neurons. So practically I think there is not any requirement of anything else. That's the two type of neurons we need. Neurons that are taking the information from your sense organs to the central nervous system, or neurons that take the information from your central nervous system to the target organs. What else do you think you can require? I'll tell you. Let's say this was your sensory neuron. The green one was the sensory neuron, but the sensory neuron started from the fingers and ended over here. That's it. This much was the size of the sensory neuron. If the sensory neuron ends over here, who's going to send the information to the brain? It will require the help of what? Some other neurons. Like for example, if I am sitting in one corner of the room and the electric socket or the plug is on the other corner and my charging wire is not that much long, what do you think I should use now? Extension wires. So let's say if there is a sensory neuron that arises maybe from here. This is a sensory neuron arising from one of your fingers, but this sensory neuron finishes over here. Done. Here's your sensory neuron. Was supposed to collect the information from this finger and stimulate the brain about it, but then it has ended midway, near the elbow only. So how do I send the information now to the brain? Very easy. There will be another neuron over here that will be collecting the information and passing it on further till this place. Then one more neuron that would be collecting the information from here and transmitting it further. And then finally, maybe one more neuron that will be collecting the information from here and ultimately bringing it to your brain. So in this picture now, if this was your sensory neuron, what are all these neurons then? They are called the connectors, or the interneurons, or the relay neurons. What is relay? You've seen relay races where one racer is running, and then they've got that baton in their hand. They pass it on to the next racer, then to the next one. So that is called 4 into 100-meter relay racing. So relay racing is the one where one racer is going to basically hand over the baton to another, who will then carry it forward. One runner is going to pass over the baton to another, who will pass it on to the next one, who will pass it on to the next one, finally reaching to the finish line. So if this is your sensory neuron, all these are interneurons, and the same is applicable on this side also. Let's say the motor neuron ended over here, so there will be 1, 2, maybe 3 interneurons finally reaching to your target organ. Okay, so do the interneurons have any fixed function, whether they'll behave as sensory or motor? No, they can behave in either of the ways. Who will decide how will they behave? Their location. If an interneuron is attached in front of a sensory neuron, it has to behave sensory. If an interneuron is attached in front of a motor neuron, it has to behave what? Motor. But then you got the idea that all these neurons, the ones that are basically helping in long distance transmission of the impulses, these are called interneurons, or relay neurons, or connector neurons, or association neurons. There's one more place in the body where they are found, the interneurons, association neurons, or relay neurons. Here, let me tell you again, look at the picture. This is a sensory neuron bringing the information to your brain, and this is a motor neuron taking the information to your muscle. Do you think the sensory and the motor neurons can also, or should also, communicate with each other? Yes, the sensory information should be given to the motor neurons, so that the motor neuron can control the body activities accordingly. So how do your sensory and motor neurons inside the brain communicate with each other? They communicate with each other with the help of the same neurons, which are small sized and are located within the brain only. So these are also what? Interneurons. If you read the NCERT, there is a very clear line mentioned in the NCERT that most of the parts of the brain have got relay neurons or interneurons in them. Those parts are called association areas of the brain. If this is your brain, parts of the brain where motor neurons are arising from, these are motor parts of the brain. Parts of your brain where sensory information is being received, these are the sensory parts of the brain. Sensory part, motor part. What are these portions of the brain called? These are called association parts. Association parts are the ones that have got the interneurons that help the sensory and the motor areas to communicate with each other. And in fact, the reality is maximum areas of your brain are actually what? Association areas. The ones that help in integration of activities of sensory and motor neurons, because what is present in all those association areas? Association neurons or interneurons. So have a look at the picture before I take you up to define the interneurons. Sensory neurons, motor neurons, long distance transmission can be done with the help of interneurons. Inside the brain also interneurons are there, helping in communication of sensory neurons with the motor neurons. So let's go here to write down the definition. Interneurons, or association or relay neurons. Neurons that actually help in neurons which are present in the brain to help the sensory and motor neurons communicate with each other. So what was I just telling you? All parts of the brain where sensory neurons are accumulated are called sensory parts of the brain. All parts of the brain where motor neurons are accumulated, they are called motor parts of the brain. And all parts of your brain where interneurons are there, they are called association areas of your brain, because what type of neurons are present there? Association neurons. Okay, so neurons which are present in the brain to help the sensory and motor neurons to communicate with each other, and also present everywhere in the body. Also present everywhere in the body as the most abundant neuron. What type of neurons are most abundant in the body? Sensory neuron or interneurons? Interneurons. Also present everywhere in the body as the most abundant neurons. And what do they help in? Help in long distance transmission of sensory as well as motor impulses. Long distance transmission of sensory as well as motor impulses. Here we can see the picture again. A small sensory neuron, long distance transmission of sensory impulses. How is that done? With the help of the interneurons. And this information also explained to us one more point, that who are the most abundant neurons in our brain. They are the in the body, the most abundant neurons in our body are interneurons. In fact, in the brain also, association areas are the most common areas of the brain where interneurons are present to help in communication between the sensory and the motor neurons. So that's it, guys. This was all about types of neurons. What we learned over here were two categories of neurons. One on the basis of their structures, unipolar, pseudo-unipolar, bipolar, multipolar. Another on the basis of functions, sensory, motor, and interneurons. This picture helps us understand what exactly are sensory, motor, and interneurons. Okay. So that's it. We'll end our lecture here today, and in our next lecture I would basically explain to you what exactly is a nerve impulse, that is mechanism of nerve impulse generation and then its conduction. Till then, just keep going through this content, keep sharing, tell your friends about the channel so that they can also subscribe, and I'll meet you in the next channel then, next session then. Thank you so much. Bye bye.